Thank you, please. Good morning. I want to, first of all...
In June of 2000, President Bill Clinton made a historic announcement from the White House.
I believe one of the great truths to emerge from this triumphant expedition inside the human genome is that in genetic terms, all human beings, regardless of race, are more than 99.9% the same. What that means is that modern science has confirmed what we first learned from ancient faiths. The most important fact of life on this earth is our common humanity.
The mapping of the human genome ushered science into the future with a better understanding of who we are and what we're made of. That was 26 years ago this month. So why is medicine still leaning on old assumptions and myths that Black bodies are fundamentally different? This is the Race Equation from the New England Journal of Medicine. I'm Rachel Gottbaum. I'm sure you've heard it before. The idea that each racial group has a different set of genes that put them at risk for certain diseases. But at the same time, it's understood that race is a social construct and not a biological category. So how should we understand the relationship between race and genetics? And what should doctors know when it comes to using our genetic code to identify disease? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Graves, a professor of biology at North Carolina A&T State University, and Dr. Sarah Tishkoff. She's a professor of genetics and biology at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to you both.
Hi, thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
So, Dr. Tishkoff, to start us off, give us a definition of race.
Oh, you're asking such easy questions. So the issue I have had for many years with this question, what is race, is that it has so many different definitions and different meanings depending on who you speak with. If I were to ask my students, how do you define race? The majority of people will say skin color. Terrible way to define race. Skin color is actually an adaptive trait. It has to do with protection from UV. So we see people with darkly pigmented skin all around the world, wherever there are high UV levels. So historically, there have been both social and biological factors that have been merged together to define race, and that's a huge problem. Really, it is predominantly a social way of classifying people. And it has historically been correlated with a number of things, such as hierarchical thinking, very bad practices like eugenics. And so really, we tend to think of it as a social construction, not having to do with genetics.
So, Dr. Graves, what are your thoughts?
Well, most people confuse our social definitions of race with biological subdivisions within the human species. There are two criteria that are used in modern biology for the existence of a biological race in any species. And the first criterion has to do with the amount of genetic variation within particular groups versus that between them. And the second criterion has to do with whether any group within the species can be considered an evolutionarily unique lineage. And neither of those criteria really hold for human beings. And so while we do have geographically based genetic variation, it doesn't rise to the level where we can legitimately say that one group is a biological race compared to another.
So what do we need to know about the genetic similarities or differences within racial groups?
Since the 1970s, we find that there's more genetic variation within these so-called racial groups than there is between them. And so if we were just doing basic statistics, then you say those groups are not different. If you look at Europeans, if you look at sub-Saharan Africans, if you look at Eurasians, if you look at East Asians, there's more genetic variation in those groups than between them. So we can't really legitimately call those races. We've always had high levels of migration between various human groups, reproducing with each other. And so we're one continuously varying population across the planet.
So as a species, we've migrated too much to have one genetic lineage, a lineage that would be considered a race. And all humans originally came from Africa. So, Dr. Tishkoff, you study Africa. What have you learned about disease and race from your work?
So, yes, I have a background in both anthropology and human genetics. It had always been my dream, frankly, since I read Margaret Mead's book when I was in high school, that I really wanted to do field work. And the reason that I started this research when I was a graduate student at Yale, I was working in a lab and they had DNA samples from people around the world. There were just 2 from Africa. These were from 2 rainforest hunter-gatherer groups, and these were being called representative Africans. Not at all the case, we now know. But they thought, that's okay. Any African group, will just use that as sort of an outgroup. And it's representative of Africa. We started looking at patterns of variation in the genome. And what stood out to me is that I saw so much variation between the different ethnic groups that we were looking at in Africa compared to what we were seeing between Eurasian populations. And that got me fascinated. Once I became a faculty member, I started doing research in Africa. I realized that once we start talking to these groups, that there's been intermarriage with neighboring groups. So we start looking at all the neighboring groups who are very linguistically diverse, and often linguistics does correlate to some extent with genetic variation. And in these earliest studies, we found that the variation between these African groups was almost as much as we're seeing across the whole globe. So what does that mean about there being an African race? How could this possibly be so? Because we see so much variation between ethnic groups in Africa. That's what we've learned in this research.
So, what you're saying is we've had a misunderstanding of the definition of race and we're confusing it with ancestry. So, let's talk about how genetics is used and misused in research.
The term Black is a social definition of race that really encompasses a whole bunch of groups who have different ancestry profiles. But in our society, people with the classification of Black, for a number of reasons, are treated in clinical ways that assume that they are one the same and are genetically different in ways that matter with regard to disease predisposition from other groups. And that's where a genetic approach to medicine is wrong, because the large number of genetic variants that are associated with the disease are found everywhere. Also, the percentage of diseases where genetics is really the driving thing is only about 5% of all diseases. And so if you're inaccurately describing human genetic variation and associating it with particular groups as if that is the reason that they differ in disease profiles, then you're making tremendous mistakes, and these mistakes harm patients at the end of the day.
To me, it's not always clear-cut. If we look at our evolutionary history, we all originated in Africa, and then there's this migration out 60 to 80,000 years ago. People are migrating to different regions. This on a broader timescale, it's really, really recent. If you look at the level of the genome, we're something like 99.9 something percent similar. That's clear because we all share this recent common ancestry in Africa not that long ago. That is not to say that differences don't exist. When people migrate into new regions, sometimes just by chance, we call it genetic drift, you get random fluctuations in the frequency of different variants that can happen. You can have new mutations happening. You can have natural selection. People may have variants that become common because they increase the fitness of the person who has more children and their children have more children, and it becomes common in the population. Sometimes those variants may also put them at risk for disease. Now we have some classic examples. Many people have heard about sickle cell anemia. People who have 2 copies of the mutation that causes sickle cell disease in Africa, for example, people who are not being treated will die at a very young age. However, people who have 1 copy of the sickle mutation, but 1 unaffected gene, they actually are protected from malaria. And malaria is one of the biggest killers even today, globally. And so for that reason, the mutation remains common in the population.
Most people don't realize that it's found in basically every population that's been exposed to high malaria transmission. And so the range of this variant goes through the Mediterranean, tropical Africa, into Greece, into the Saudi Peninsula, and all the way into India. So all of those populations suffer from sickle cell anemia. In fact, the frequency of sickle cell anemia in Greeks today is actually higher than it is in African Americans. And so you can't see sickle cell anemia as being a racially associated disease. It's associated with the presence or absence of malaria.
There are other examples, such as there's a mutation in a gene that is associated with a 10 to 20-fold increased risk for kidney disease. We see it predominantly in people of recent West African ancestry. It appears that it is protective against a parasite that causes sleeping sickness. So I think we have to balance the fact that there is some variation that exists. Some of it may be medically relevant, but we have to be so careful not to just categorize people by these broad racial categories that don't get into the subtle, not so subtle, often big differences, even within a region. And many common diseases like hypertension and diabetes, heart disease, they are probably largely, if not predominantly, impacted by social demographic factors and diet and environment. But that's not to say that there aren't also some genetic risk factors as well. And the variants that impact risk for those diseases may differ in people from different regions.
So, how have we been using genetic information, say, to diagnose disease in ways that may be problematic?
So, one of the problems has been that nowadays we have these really large genomic databases, biobanks that have electronic health records. And there's been a huge bias in these biobanks towards people of European ancestry. And they look at correlations with whatever the disease is that you're looking at, say heart disease, and they find a genetic variant that is associated with the trait. Then it's thought that a mutation that may be playing a role in that disease is somewhere nearby. Some people are using those to estimate genetic risk scores for disease. And it's been well documented that when this is done in European ancestry populations, and then you apply this to a patient who is of a different ancestry, it doesn't perform well. And it does particularly poorly in people of African ancestry. And that's why I think we do need to include people from diverse populations in research. We do need to consider both the genetic and the environmental factors that together are influencing risk for disease. And sometimes those risk factors may be different in different populations.
So I'm going to give you an example of an algorithm that's really misleading, and that's the bone density algorithms. So it turns out that generally people of Western African ancestry have greater bone density than Western Europeans do. But it also turns out that people of East African descent have lower bone density than Western Europeans do. So if you think that all Black people have greater bone density because they're Black, then you're going to make a mistake if you apply that algorithm to people of East African ancestry, because they actually have lower bone density than Western Africans. And that's where these algorithms run afoul, because they make assumptions about a group of people who are variable as if they are all the same. That's why we can't confuse socially defined race with genetic variation, because they are not the same thing.
It suggests to me also that maybe physicians should be asking their patients about their ancestry. And I don't mean necessarily genetic ancestry. You can literally ask someone, where did your parents come from? Where did your grandparents come from? And you're going to get a lot of information simply from that. Ultimately, because of the fact that people can have mixed ancestry, and there's so much genetic variation that even if you were someone of, say, West African ancestry, you may or may not have sickle cell disease. Ultimately, we want to know what the mutations are, right? We need to know what the actual mutations are that the patient has. But the problem is we're a ways off from that. We are not close to being able to characterize what the majority of variation in the human genome is doing.
But in this country, we're obsessed with finding a genetic link or cause for disease. So, for example, Black Americans suffer from much higher rates of heart disease and diabetes. And historically, some scientists have pointed the finger to race-specific genes. So how should we be thinking about that differently?
Well, I would tell you right away that you can't ascribe a genetic cause unless you're dealing with individuals who share the same environment. And in the United States, our different socially defined racial groups do not share the same environment. Now, people often use the big ones like socioeconomic status. Okay, and say, well, if you've got this socioeconomic status, then you're sharing the same environment. But it turns out that that's not really true. So, what people like me, who I actually don't do research on human beings, my research has always been in experimental systems that I can manipulate, like fruit flies and bacteria and viruses. And even with the stuff I work on, you find incredibly powerful environmental differences that you wouldn't even have imagined were there. And so I know it's much worse with a complex organism like human beings. And so again, if we're going to be training physicians and biomedical researchers in medical genetics, we need to be doing it properly.
And I want to second that. I do agree that we tend to look at what the genetic factors are influencing these traits, because frankly, it's a lot easier to do that than to understand what the environmental factors are and what the interaction between genetics and environment is that influences risk for disease. It's hard. It's really, really hard to do. And it means that you have to collect information, detailed information about many aspects of the environment if you really want to try to figure that out. Most of these electronic health records that are these big giant biobanks that people are using, they don't have that. They have zip code often. That's not sufficient. And if you want to talk about a place where maybe race is important, it might be when looking at these social environmental factors because of things like racism and how people are treated based on either how they might self-identify or how somebody else is identifying them. But at the same time, race is not the perfect proxy by any means for environment. So one needs to be getting as much information as possible about environmental risk factors for disease. I think that's something that has not been studied sufficiently.
So should race be used as a proxy at all in biomedical research?
Race is a sociological variable. And for sociological studies, it could be incredibly powerful. So to the degree to which, for example, you're looking at a social determinant of health, race as a socially defined factor could tell us a great deal, and it has told us a great deal. For example, things like who's more likely to live within 1 mile of a toxic waste site. Okay, it turns out that socially defined race is a better predictor of whether you live within 1 mile of a toxic waste site. And living within 1 mile of a toxic waste site undoubtedly has impacts on your health. It fails when you try to use it as a predictor of genomic characteristics.
I don't think that nowadays geneticists need to be relying on racial classifications because we can look at the genetics. And don't forget that in the US, what we call different races changes every, 10 years or so, 20 years. You look at what they use in the government census, it's changing all the time, right? So there are all kinds of problems with that. If you are looking at health disparities, for example, in some contexts, it could be informative, but most of the time, it's not. Okay, what about genetic ancestry? There can be problems when somebody just substitutes race and uses genetic ancestry. So, for example, instead of saying, my patients are the Black race, and you just say they're of African ancestry. Some might say, well, that's better than using a racial classifier, but you have to be careful because now when you say genetic ancestry, it's giving it a genetic meaning, it's giving it a biological meaning. But what does African ancestry mean? Because I've shown that there's a lot of different ancestries in Africa, variable African ancestries. Are we talking not even in West Africa and Central Africa, we have a recent study where we're showing variation between people from, let's say, Cameroon and Sierra Leone and Ghana. And so you have to be careful if you just substitute Black and say African ancestry or white and European ancestry. You're still referring to these continental types of classifiers in a way that could also be making it worse. So don't use it if you don't need to. And most of the time you don't.
So essentially, if you say African descent, that's really ambiguous because that could mean anything, couldn't it?
People who came from somewhere on the continent of Africa. But if you're talking about legacy African Americans like me, I also have at least 16 to 20% of my genome that originated in Europe. And we also know, because of the history of slavery and migrations in the United States, that different groups of African Americans have different amounts of European ancestry. So in a place like Kansas, it's more like 30%. West Virginia, it's 30%. In Washington State, it's 30%. So for any risk variant associated with a given disease for those people, there's a 30% chance that that variant actually originated in Europe, not in some portion of Africa. And so that's the kind of sophistication that we need. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to identifying which genetic variants are associated with which particular problem. Not that somebody came from Africa or they came from Europe, is what variant are they carrying that's associated with this particular problem. So say a person has hypertension, and a whole bunch of genetic variants contribute to hypertension. So on average, 30% of those variants would have come from Europe, and 70% would have come from Africa. But it still comes down to identifying which specific variants are contributing to the problem. The African ones may have been great, and maybe the European ones that are the problem. But again, since a person is called Black, it's an assumption that the problem originates with their blackness, not their whiteness, which is sort of crazy. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter where their ancestry was or came from. It matters which portions of their genome are contributing to their disease problem. And that could be the ones that came from Europe. That could be the ones that came from Africa. It could be a mix of some European and some African ones. So the problem here is that people are thinking in these racial terms, like hypertension is a Black disease. Therefore, it must be the fact that you have this African ancestry that gives you a greater risk to hypertension. And that's ridiculous. That's the stuff that we're trying to debunk.
I do agree. But at the same time, I remember when I was in grad school, one thing that we were taught is that when they identify genetic risk factors for disease, you often will see differences in prevalence having to do with their demographic history and perhaps adaptation to different environments. We know, for example, there are certain diseases more common in people who are Ashkenazi Jewish. That is the reality. A doctor would want to know that. If, for example, they might advise a patient, you should get tested for a panel. That's information that is good to know. At the same time, I think what Dr. Grace is also pointing out is you don't want to have this racial stereotyping where you just assume that it must all be this or it can't be that. Because most of us have parts of our genomes that come from different places. And that is the reality.
So what needs to change?
I think these are blunt force tools, so to speak. And we should be getting rid of this racial categorization as much as possible in medicine. It means that we have to have more research to understand genetic and environmental factors and their interaction and what role they play in disease so that ultimately we can identify at the individual genome level what the risk factors are that a person might have. That is the goal. We have ways to go, but that's what we're trying to attain. So one of the reasons that we are interested in studying diverse cohorts, Africans, for example, because they have so much genetic variation that it can be very powerful for identifying regions of the genome or genes that are playing a role in risk for disease, or it might be therapeutic targets for treatment. But once you find those genes or you find those targets, they're effective in everybody.
So I agree with Sarah about, diversifying the cohorts. But if we're really concerned with reducing health disparities, most of that really isn't going to be done by biomedical research. It's changing the conditions of life of these people so that they have access to the things that keep you healthy, like nice green spaces and access to healthcare and jobs so that they can pay for healthy food and things like that. If our goal is to reduce health disparities, that's the simplest way to do it. It's to reduce the causes that make people sick.
Thank you both so very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
I've been speaking with Joseph Graves. He's a professor of biology at North Carolina A&T State University, and Sarah Tishkoff. She's a professor of genetics and biology at the University of Pennsylvania. Next time on The Race Equation, we meet the doctors who are working to overturn racist medical practices that continue to harm patients.
I'll just never forget, honestly, hearing this thing that people called PPP, piss poor protoplasm, which is basically saying like, oh, the reason this patient keeps getting sick or keeps coming into the ER is just because they have bad genes.
I know that they didn't wake up one day to discriminate against little Black girls, but the fact that the disparities in treatment could potentially result in differential outcomes for little Black girls is unacceptable.
The Race Equation is a special series from the New England Journal of Medicine. It's reported by me, Rachel Gottbaum. Our senior producer is Catherine Fenolosa. Our editor is Sarah Kate Kramer. Sound design by James Trout. Andrea Lopez Cruzado is our fact checker. We had help from Dr. Aaron Baugh, Dr. Winfred Williams, Christine Gwynn, Adam Strauss, and Leah Katia Marchwinski. Funding for this series is provided by the Doris Duke Foundation, committed to building a creative, equitable, and sustainable future.